Josh Peck here. Hope you are doing well. Wanted to talk about something we haven't talked about in quite a while. And this is important because we got a lot of new subscribers to the channel that may not have heard this. But this is really cool. So, um, for those not familiar, the book of Enoch opens with this: the words of the blessing of Enoch, wherewith be blessed the elect and righteous, who will be living in the day of tribulation, when all the wicked and godless are to be removed. And he took up his parable and said, Enoch, a righteous man, whose eyes were opened by God, saw the vision of the Holy One in the heavens, which the angel showed me, and from them I heard everything, and from them I understood as I saw, but not for this generation, but for a remote one, which is for to come. So that's First Enoch 1 through 3a. So, um, the book of Enoch opens by saying that this book is not for the generation it was written in, but for a future one that's going to have to go through living in the day of tribulation, that it says. So, on this channel, we talk a lot about Bible prophecy and the end times, the last days. Are we living in those days? Are we living in the birth pangs right before the tribulation? And I think this is another piece of the puzzle, because the book of Enoch was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s. We did have an Ethiopic version of it before that, but we didn't know if it was if it was accurate or if it was made up, basically. But when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, we were able to compare it and see that the Ethiopic one was pretty accurate. But even though the Book of Enoch was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 40s, it wasn't really translated and made available to the general public till sometime around the 1990s, somewhere around there. And even then, though, there were parts of the Essene calendar system that's talked about in the Book of Enoch that weren't fully understood until around 2017 or 2018. And so now we have the last piece of the Enochian puzzle, which tells us that since we can finally understand the whole thing, that we're living in, or at least very close to, that time that the Book of Enoch was written for, if we believe it to be accurate. Now, I have talked a lot about the idea of 2,000-year ages from the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I talk a lot about that in my books, my two-volume set, Forgotten Prophecies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I have lots of videos on that. We're going to be talking about something a little different from the Book of Enoch, which is kind of a different way, a different way of looking at the 7,000 years of totality that the Essenes believed was creation or human history, or however you want to phrase it. So, along with the Essene calendar and the ancient understanding of ages that I outline in my two-volume book set, Forgotten Prophecies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Enoch provides us with another way of measuring time. And this is not as much of a calendar as it is like a prophetic formula. And it's really interesting, and it's really, really accurate. So I'm really excited to talk about this today, because I know a lot of you, unless you've been with me a long time, a lot of you haven't heard this. And if you have heard this before, then this is a good refresher. But this formula, um, uh, it does encompass the entire 7,000 years of human history. So the Essenes, who were the writers and keepers of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the time of Jesus, they believed in a complete calendar from creation to the new creation, new heavens, new earth, that time was going to be 7,000 years. And they split that up into ages, into basically 3.5 ages. So an age is 2,000 years, according to the Essenes, and then the last age, which is the Sabbath, would have been 1,000 years, and we know that is the millennial reign of Christ. So they talked about this in the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff. And a lot of that calendar system comes from the Book of Enoch, but there is another place in the Book of Enoch that splits up the 7,000 years a little differently. Again, not as a calendar, but just as a prophecy. So, Now, with the idea of 2,000 year ages, and I do lay it all out in the book, we've had to pull from other sources to actually get that. It is consistent with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Dead Sea Scrolls that would have talked about that are extremely damaged. And so we've had to kind of pull from other sources and traditions. I have a whole chapter on it in my book, but while we may not have fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls that clearly lay out, the idea of 2,000 year ages, we do have something in the book of Enoch showing a totality of 7,000 years. So instead of being split up into seven 1,000 periods or four ages in three and a half 2,000 year periods, human history is divided into 10 700-year periods called weeks, with each day equaling 100 years. So this prophecy is called Enoch's 10 weeks or Enoch's apocalypse of weeks, which I think sounds really cool. So the prophecy comes from the book of Enoch, chapters 91 and 93. Now, we do have some fragments from the prophecy from the Dead Sea Scrolls to compare what we have from the Ethiopic version. So if we're understanding this correctly, the years of the 10 weeks should be as follows. So I'll put a chart up on the screen. So in the first column, it's the number of the week, the prophetic week. Remember, each day in the week is 100 years. Now the next column is years in AM. This is how the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls, would have looked at time. They started basically from the year 0 or 1, uh, and I don't know which, and that's why a lot of people have asked me, like, well, lately you've been saying it's 20. You said that 2025 would be the final jubilee, but now it's March of 2026. It's because of this. It's because of this AM thing. I didn't know whether they started from the year 0. Did they call the first year 0, or did they call it 1? Um, and so that's why it turns out the final Jubilee does start in March of 2026, so just a few months away. But anyway, so AM means Anno Monday. It's just year of the world. So they would have started at 0 or 1, like I said, and they would have counted up. Now we have BC and AD, and that's that third column there. So that tells us in the way that we measure time, something like how we would recognize it, how we would be familiar with. So the third column is years BC and AD, and then the fourth, the final column, is the chapter and verse that you find the prophecy for each of these weeks. So it starts off, week number 1 is from 0 to 700 AM, so that would be 3925 to 3225 BC, and we get that from uh, Enoch 93 verse 3. And so on and so forth. You can look through the whole thing. But what's interesting is if you look at the ninth and 10th weeks. So week 9 is according to the way they would have measured years, it's 5,600 to 6,300. But for us, it would be AD 1675 to 2375. Now you might think, wow, that's really far away. But remember, these weeks are only 700-year periods. So this last week would be from 1675 to 2375, but somewhere in there the millennium would have already started. Because the next one is 6300 to uh 7000, right? So that's less than 100, that's less than 1,000 years. So we're gonna get into all of that, but I just wanted you to take a look at that. So that's the chart. Again, I have the whole chart in that PDF, or if you want to get the PDF. Now, what's amazing about this prophecy is its really astounding accuracy. Now, while we don't have the complete prophecy in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have enough to compare it to the Ethiopic version of Enoch, and they match considerably well. So, if the parts that we have match, then it stands to reason that the rest would match as well. Because for the translators of the Ethiopic version to invent the prophecy, they would have had to know exactly what parts would be discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, what parts would be lost to time and degradation. So the fact that The parts that we have match really well. It stands to reason the parts that we don't have would have matched as well. So whatever we don't have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can safely fill in with the Ethiopic version. Um, so Enoch's Apocalypse of weeks 1 through 6. So study of this 10-week prophecy can become very extensive, and it really could fill the pages of a book all its own. But we can look at some of the basics to show its accuracy. So the Dead Sea Scrolls provide us with week 1, the first half of week 2, the second half of week 7, and weeks 8 through 10 in full. That's what we get from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We can fill in the rest of the weeks with the Ethiopic version. So, explaining the first week and part of the second from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the book of Enoch says, when he was delivering his letter, Enoch resumed his speech and said, I, Enoch, was born on the seventh day in the first week, and until my time justice was strong. After me will come the second week when deceit and violence will increase. So some translations, such as the Ethiopic Giez to English, render this passage as if Enoch was saying he was born the seventh in a genealogical line during the first week. The Dead Sea Scrolls version says he was born on the seventh day in the first week. Now, this is really interesting because in actuality, both of these would be correct. So if we do the math, we discover that Enoch was born in the year 622 a.m., which would have been on the seventh day in the first week, if each day is 100 years. So it would have been in that final 100 years of that week. Also, in accordance with the Ethiopic version, Enoch was the seventh generation from Adam. So both of those would be correct. Now, we're given the first few words of the second week from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So to understand what's being said about the entire second week, we can look to the Ethiopic version, which is where we'll obtain all Ethiopic translations from this prophecy. So it says, and after me there shall arise in the second week great wickedness, and deceit shall have sprung up, and in it there shall be the first end, and in it a man shall be saved, and after it is ended unrighteousness shall grow up, and a law shall be made for the sinners. So this is clearly talking about the events that led up to Noah's flood. Great wickedness was caused by fallen angels mating with human women, and we read about that in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and then there was the first end. Now, we're not sure exactly what this is because, the flood would have happened in 1656 a.m., yet this week would conclude in 1400 a.m. So it's possible that the first end described here doesn't have to do with the world being destroyed by the flood, but instead is referring to the genetic and moral corruption of humanity in the days of Jared, which we read about in Enoch 6, verse 6, which would fall in line with this timeline. So also the it from after it is ended might be talking about the wickedness itself, or it could be talking about the second week itself. Now, in either case, this part of the prophecy could be looking ahead a bit past the second week. Noah would be the man who was saved, though rather than describing the flood, this would be referring to him being saved from the fallen angels and Nephilim giants on the earth in those days. He was saved away from all of that stuff going on. Unrighteousness rises again, so there's a law for the sinners, which might be what Noah was preaching about during this time from 2 Peter 2:5, before the flood was announced. Now, for week 3, the book of Enoch says, and after that, in the third week, at its close, a man shall be elected as the plant of righteous judgment, and his posterity shall become the plant of righteousness forevermore. So since this only discusses the close of the third week, it could be that the description of the second week bled over a little bit into the beginning of the third. If this is happening, we could consider the second and the third weeks together, in which case we could include the flood. Now, near the close of the third week, the only man this could be referring to is Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. This also tells us the term plant of righteousness has to do with the Jewish people, and that's important to know because it'll come up again. Week 4, Enoch says, and after that, in the fourth week, at its close, visions of the holy and righteous shall be seen, and a law for all generations, and an enclosure shall be made for them. So the events that best fit this description within this time are the Exodus and the giving of the law to Moses and the children of Israel. Moses saw visions of the holy and righteous upon Mount Sinai. The law for all generations is the Torah, and the enclosures most likely referring to the tabernacle or the first entrance of the promised land by the children of Israel, since that falls within this time period as well. Next, Enoch says about week 5. And after that, in the 5th week, at its close, the house of glory and dominion shall be built forever. So this could be describing Solomon's temple, which would have been around 2935 a.m. However, since it says at its close, it is most likely referring to the Second Temple, which would have been in 3408 a.m. This could also have something to do with Israel itself rather than only the temple. Also, I want to know, sometimes in Hebrew, the word forever doesn't mean a never-ending span of time, but it means like a dispensation of time. Uh, and I developed that idea, excuse me. I developed that idea further in another chapter of my 2 volume set when we read through a Dead Sea Scroll called Psalms of Exorcism, but since it applies to this prophecy as well, it should at least be mentioned here. So we don't necessarily need to look for some kind of house that still exists, though it could be that, but we can also include something that was built for a dispensation of time, and the temple would fit that description. By the way, if you want a source for that, you could look at Arnold Fruchtenbaum's Messianic Bible Study 176, The Sabbath, and I believe that's page 31 through 33. But yeah, so sometimes when it's translated as forever in English, it doesn't always mean forever. So I don't know if that's an old English thing or what that is. But in the Hebrew, sometimes it just means for like a long time or for a set time, for a dispensation of time, stuff like that. Okay. Now, what's interesting is there's another Dead Sea Scroll called the Apocalyptic Chronology or Apocryphal Weeks that seems to be a commentary on this part of Enoch's prophecy. And it says, determined end, and afterwards will come the 5th week, 480 years after the Exodus from Egypt. Solomon built the temple. It was destroyed in the time of Zedekiah, king of Judah. It was restored by the Levites and the people of the land. Final stage, king of the Kittim. And Kittim, if I remember right, was Rome. According to the way that the Dead Sea Scrolls, the commentators would talk about it. But that's from Apocalyptic Chronology. Now, while there's not much here, we can pull a couple of details. So in his book, Ancient Prophecies from the Dead Sea Scrolls, author Dr. Ken Johnson provides his commentary. By the way, he wrote the foreword to my 2 volume set as well. Me and Ken are really good friends. But he writes, this is thought to be a commentary on Enoch's 10 weeks prophecy from Enoch 93. The 5th week was 1125 to 425 BC. The Essenes understood that the Romans, Kittim, would destroy the Jerusalem temple. We see also in Daniel 11:33 that the Romans would burn down the Jerusalem temple. All right, so a big shout out to Dr. Ken Johnson for that. Okay, moving on. So concerning week 6, Enoch says, and after that, in the 6th week, all who live in it shall be blinded, and the hearts of all of them shall godlessly forsake wisdom, and in it a man shall ascend, and at its close the house of dominion shall be burnt with fire, and the whole race of the chosen root shall be dispersed. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. So remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls were written at least 100 or 200 years before Christ, some probably longer. But it's at least 100 or 200 years before Christ. Now, it might be easy to invent everything before the 6th week. However, the Qumran community would have had the Book of Enoch prior to the birth of Christ, prior to the destruction of the temple, and prior to the scattering of the Jewish people among the nations. Yet, as we can plainly see, this is what's being described in week 6. This is also where we make the switch from BC to AD in our current system of recording years. All right, Enoch's Apocalypse of week 7. So next, and probably the most difficult to identify, and it required its own section in my two-volume set, was week 7. So the Ethiopic version says, "And after that, in the 7th week, shall an apostate generation arise, and many shall be its deeds, and all its deeds shall be apostate. And at its close shall be elected the elect righteous of the eternal plant of righteousness to receive sevenfold instruction concerning all his creation." Now, what we have from the Dead Sea Scroll version says this: "But all their deeds will be at fault. At its close, the chosen ones will be selected as witnesses of the justice from the plant of everlasting justice. They shall be given wisdom and knowledge sevenfold. They shall uproot the foundation of violence and the work of deceit in order to carry out justice." So, as we can see, we're given a little extra information in the Dead Sea Scroll. So, many have assumed that verse 9 from the Ethiopic version is talking about the Catholic Church in the Dark Ages. And this very well could be. However, Islam was also founded during this time, so we would have to consider that possibility as well. But to narrow it down, we must identify the other group mentioned, called the Chosen Ones, who are selected as witnesses of the justice from the plant of everlasting justice, according to the Dead Sea Scroll version. So the Ethiopic version translates this as the elect righteous of the eternal plant of righteousness. Now remember, from week 3, the plant of righteousness has to do with Abraham and the Jewish people. So we should be able to find a sect of Jewish people who are called out from many Jews during this time. This should also have something to do with wisdom and knowledge or an instruction concerning his creation. It should be a substantial change from the norm at the time, since it's described as a sevenfold instruction and wisdom and knowledge sevenfold. Well, months before I was writing that part for my book, I was really puzzling over this prophecy, and I could not figure it out. I believed that it might somehow involve Catholicism of that time, perhaps the iconoclast movement having to do with idolatry, since it was occurring then. While I was researching this, though, I only had access to the Ethiopic translation, and I wasn't aware of the slight differences and additions found in the Dead Sea Scrolls version. Um, because I had written about this before my two-volume set even came out. There was an earlier version that was just a single book that's not in print anymore. Um, so at that time, that's what I had. And I even emailed Dr. Ken Johnson about what I was thinking at the time, though admittedly I wasn't convinced of it fully myself. And actually, here's an excerpt of that email um, that I sent to Dr. Ken Johnson. This is just an excerpt, but I said, the only thing I can find that remotely fits this is the Second Council of Nicaea, which had 7 sessions, each one ending with a determination, so literally 7 distinct teachings slash instructions, and it all related to the veneration of icons, or what we might go as far as to say the veneration or worship of idols. The second commandment says not to make, worship, and serve any graven images of any in heaven, earth, or in the sea, basically all of creation. Now, the Second Council of Nicaea determined the veneration of icons was acceptable, but what if the ones who determined that were part of the apostate generation, and the instruction that the righteous were receiving concerning all of creation was a bad instruction from the apostates about icons slash idols? Is it possible the instruction the righteous received does not come from God and is not a good instruction? End quote. So that was just a little excerpt. So that was kind of where my mind was going. And, yeah, I still admit that's still possible. I mean, it does kind of fit. Um, but after I sent that email, I knew I needed more study. But at the time, I felt like I had exhausted all my options. The initial interpretation I concluded didn't seem to fit exactly right. I mean, I could kind of make it fit, but I don't want to do that. I don't want to make something fit. I want something to fit, and if it doesn't fit, then it doesn't fit. And I didn't know if this fit or not. But I just simply didn't know where else to look. Now, I've learned throughout the years the best thing to do in these situations is to put it in prayer, leave it to the Lord, and wait on Him to reveal the answer if He so chooses. And so that's exactly what I did. Well, months later, up until the day before the time of the original of my original writing. Excuse me. Um,
I've talked about it many times before, but the ancient Jewish group called the Essenes, who were around at the time of Christ, said that they were the ones who kept the original prophetic calendar God gave to Adam. Did you know that calendar has actually been reproduced today from the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls? That's right, and now you can own one for yourself. So the Dead Sea Scroll wall calendar is now available and contains both the Essenes calendar as well as our own calendar, so you can compare the dates and see if they fall on anything interesting or prophetic in this amazing and ancient calendar. The calendar itself was developed by Dr. Ken Johnson and put into print by yours truly, so proceeds from the sales of this calendar go to support both Dr. Ken Johnson's ministry as well as Daily Renegade. It's amazing because this is the exact calendar that the Bible itself uses from Genesis all the way to Revelation. It's a great study tool and can even make a great gift for your prophecy loving friends and family members. Click on the link in the description below to pick up yours today.
I was writing on the 10 weeks prophecy of Enoch, and I stopped after week 6. The end of the workday had come, but I knew that the following day, um, I would. I knew that the following day I would have to once again tackle week 7. Now, I always felt that the icon slash idol interpretation wasn't completely satisfactory. It still could fit, but unless there's something I'm missing, it wasn't just clicking as well as I felt like it should. So I didn't want to offer that as a valid interpretation in my book. Um, I was ready to simply admit that I had no idea what the interpretation is and move on to week 8. And I would have put the way that I would have done it, I would have put my thoughts down. I would have said maybe this iconoclast thing, but I don't know, it doesn't really fit. I would have just been honest about it. But that night, the night before I had to come back to write this part, that night I was relaxing in bed and I was getting ready to sleep for the night. I turned on a series that I had been watching during my downtime by Dr. Chuck Missler, a brilliant Bible teacher who went home to be with the Lord in May of 2018. The series was on the book of Colossians. It had absolutely nothing to do with the book of Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or really any other subject addressed in my set, in my 2 book set, or in the book that I was working on at the time. I was about halfway through the series, around the 4th or 5th session, and then suddenly, seemingly at random, but too precise to be mere chance, the answer to Enoch's 7th week appeared on the screen. And the funny thing is, Dr. Missler wasn't teaching anything about the book of Enoch. There was no indication that he even knew his teaching had anything to do with this prophecy. I quickly paused the television after his explanation. I turned to my wife and I said, "That's it. That's Enoch's 7th week." And I quickly made note of it in my phone for the following day, and then I turned the session back on. Well, about an hour later in the next session, another interesting bit of seemingly coincidental teaching came up. Dr. Missler started describing a practice that every Christian should begin doing, considering a familiar Bible verse. John 14:26 says, "But the Comforter, which is the Holy Ghost, whom the Father will send in my name, he shall teach you all things and bring all things to your remembrance, whatsoever I have said unto you." So he suggested, Dr. Missler suggested, that anytime we come across an unfamiliar verse in the Bible and don't know what it means, we should pray to God for the answer, remind him of his promise in John 14:26, and wait. Dr. Missler then suggested keeping a record of the verse in a personal journal for later use. He said it likely will not happen right away, but eventually God will reveal the answer, and most likely he'll do it in an unexpected way, such as in an overheard conversation or a thought that occurs while eating dinner, something like that. Somehow, he said, God will provide an answer, and when he does, he said that we should find that spot in the journal with our original question and write under it how God taught us the answer. And this is because there will be times when we as Christians go through doubts and difficult times. And when those times come, we can pick up that journal and read through the many ways that God has tutored us throughout our lives. Well, unbeknownst to Dr. Missler, he just happened to say this right after he inadvertently gave me the answer to a question I had been spending months trying to find. Um, Now, Dr. Missler recorded those sessions over a decade before God used them in my life, and as I'm sure he has used them in various ways throughout an untold number of lives since the time of their recording. And you can find those for free on YouTube, and you should definitely watch all of them. They're great. But because of this, I decided to take Dr. Missler's advice and record this story in my book, hoping that it will not only be an encouragement to me should I ever run into my own seasons of doubt, but so that it can encourage others as well. You know, we may not always be able to recognize how God is teaching us throughout our lives, but we can be assured that He is. We also may never know how God is working through our lives for the benefit of other people, but we can be certain that if we follow His desires rather than our own, He can use that obedience in amazing and really impactful ways. So, what Dr. Missler was discussing was the history of the Karaite Jewish movement. So he was explaining how they were formed and what they stood for. And I realized this was an excellent fit to week 7 of Enoch's prophecy. Um, I find it funny that I had I find it funny that I had briefly mentioned a possible connection with the Karaite Jews and Sadducees in a previous chapter of my book, which from the time of that current writing, I had written weeks before that. Had I continued that trail, I might have come to the answer of Enoch's 7th week back then, but the Lord has His perfect timing for everything. If I would have learned it back then, I wouldn't have this awesome Chuck Missler story to tell. Now, there is some debate as to when Karaite Judaism first sprung up, but most agree it gained a substantial foothold somewhere between the 7th and 9th centuries, which would fit perfectly within the time frame of Enoch's 7th week. As one online publication words it, quote, led by a Nazi prince claiming Davidic lineage, the Karaites attracted many scholars of distinction in biblical exegesis, law, Hebrew lexicography, and philosophy. So originally, the Karaite Judaism branched off from mainstream Talmudic Judaism of the time. They absolutely rejected the notion of the oral Torah. Instead, they preferred to recognize the written Torah as the supreme authority in religious law and theology, even borrowing some of their traditions and interpretations from the Essenes, among other ancient Jewish groups. And it's also believed that Karaite Judaism formed as a reaction to the rise of Islam. So this leaves us with a couple of options for how to possibly interpret week 7. If Islam is the prophesied apostate generation, and if Karaite Judaism rose as a reaction to it, then the Karaite Jews would be the elect righteous of the eternal plan of righteousness. Now, this wouldn't mean that they themselves were righteous in the sense of following Christ or anything like that. Rather, compared to what Jews in general, plant of righteousness, were doing by following the mainstream precepts of Judaism, elevating oral Torah and the Talmud above the Torah, the Karahites would be the called out ones elected to resist Islam, to go back to Torah only, and through that receive their sevenfold wisdom and knowledge. This would have been a great amount of wisdom and knowledge compared to what was found in Talmudic Judaism of that time. Now, on the other hand, there might be a simpler explanation. The apostate generation of verse 9 from the Ethiopic version might not be describing Islam or even Catholicism at all. Instead, it might be describing Talmudic Judaism itself. Remember, um, uh, so Talmudic Judaism sprung up after Talmudic Judaism sprang up after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. It was formed from surviving Pharisees. And when we look through history, ancient Pharisees were certainly violent. One only needs to read through the pages of the four Gospels to discover that fact. So Pharisees and any group developing from them would have had a tradition and history of violence, like the prophecy says. If Talmudic Judaism, which was formed from ancient Pharisaical Judaism, is the apostate generation, then it would make sense how the Karaite Jews could fulfill the rest of the prophecy. Not only were they given a sevenfold instruction concerning all of creation, which would be gained by putting the Torah, including the creation account in Genesis, above Talmudic interpretations and traditions, but by rejecting the traditions of the Pharisee turned Talmudic Jews, They would fulfill the last part of the Dead Sea Scroll version, which says, "They shall uproot the foundations of violence and work of deceit in it in order to carry out justice." So the foundation of violence and works of deceit would describe the Pharisees. So by rejecting Talmudic traditions, the Karahite Jews would have been uprooting that Pharisaical foundation. Other translations render the final part as to pass judgment on it rather than carry out justice. Now, given that, we can see how the Karahite Jews passed judgment on Talmudic Judaism. Here's one source that says about this, quote, "The best part of the Karahite intellectual effort was directed at proving the errors of the rabbinates. Their critical acuteness and thorough knowledge of rabbinical doctrines ensured the high level of their polemics, and their religious attack was accompanied by bitter social criticism of the Jewish leadership, the exilarchs, the geonim, or heads of the academies, and the dignitaries which surrounded them." So, in my opinion, Enoch's seventh week is likely not describing Catholicism or Islam, though admittedly it is still a possibility. But instead, I believe it's far more likely that the entire seventh week is regarding the rise of Karaite Judaism, elect righteous of the eternal plant of righteousness, or called out ones from mainstream Judaism, which God used to pass judgment against Talmudic Judaism, the apostate generation. And he did this by offering Karaite Jews a sevenfold instruction, wisdom and knowledge, through the Torah instead of Talmudic tradition. And that word sevenfold, that could just mean complete, because all throughout the Bible, the word seven is like it is a literal number, but it also represents like completion. And when you look at the Bible itself, that's complete. The Torah itself is complete. You don't need oral Torah and Talmudic stuff to understand it.
One of the hottest subjects in Christian circles today are the shocking revelations coming from the Dead Sea Scrolls and their unique calendar. It seems like they knew more about the arrival of the Messiah than most Christians do today. His arrival did not catch them by surprise. They even knew the exact year of his arrival. Since their calendar got it right the first time, what does it have to say about the timing of the Messiah's next arrival? Why are the years 2025 and 2026 so interesting prophetically? Well, get ready for two highly anticipated, groundbreaking books on the Dead Sea Scrolls from yours truly. Forgotten Prophecies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Unlocking the Final Jubilee of the Church Age is available now in 2 volumes, representing almost 700 pages of research on this fascinating subject that has people talking and wondering if we really are living in the final days of human history. Volume 1, which I have right here, delves into the enigmatic Jewish sect called the Essenes and their amazingly accurate prophetic calendars. Volume 2 explores new feasts and festivals that the Essenes observed and their prophetic significance, as well as tying everything together into a coherent prophetic timeline from the foundation of the book of Revelation. Well, according to ancient texts that contain completely accurate prophecies to date, we are on the precipice of entering the final jubilee of the church age. So who could have known how much influence the writings that this mysterious group of prophets and scribes hundreds of years before Christ would have on our understanding of end times prophecy? Well, as it turns out, much of what we've been taught about Israel in the first century is incomplete. There were, in fact, Jewish believers who knew exactly what to expect in his first coming, that he would be God in the flesh and that he would die for our sins. If they accurately predicted the first arrival of the Jewish Messiah, what did they have to say about his soon return? The revelations found within these books have never been uncovered before, and they affect each and every one of us today. So click on the links in the description below or head on over to prophecywatchers.com to get your copies of my new 2-volume book set today.
So, in fact, we can even see historically that Karahite Jews, because they were so different and set apart, they actually enjoyed protections that the Talmudic Jews did not. So it's possible that this was part of a judgment from God against Talmudic Judaism in a similar way that the destruction of the temple was a judgment against the Pharisees and Sadducees. So deciding to go back to the Torah and rejecting Talmudic tradition could have been enough for the Karahite Jews to escape this judgment. So, in my opinion, the theological battle between Talmudic and Karahite Judaism seems to be the most likely fulfillment of Enoch's seventh week. So, with that, let's move on to week 8. So now that the mystery of the seventh week has been uncovered, we can move to the eighth. The Ethiopic version says, "And after that there shall be another, the eighth week, that of righteousness, and a sword shall be given to it, that a righteous judgment may be executed on the oppressors, and sinners shall be delivered into the hands of the righteous. And at its close they shall acquire houses through their righteousness, and a house shall be built for the great king in glory forevermore." The Dead Sea Scroll version says it like this: "After this, the eighth week will come, the one of justice, in which a sword will be given to all the just, for them to carry out just judgment against the wicked, who will be delivered into their hands. At its close, they will gain riches and justice, and there will be built the temple of the kingship of the Great One in his magnificence for all eternal generations." Okay, so as we can see, these traditions are very similar. We have the Crusades during this time, in which, at least in part, European Christians were fighting against the oppression of Muslims. The success of the First Crusade occurred in AD 1099, right at the beginning of Enoch's eighth week. Now, and it's amazing because remember again, this was we're way ahead where we know that this was already written. So this couldn't have been written after the fact. Now, to be clear, the accuracy of this prophecy wouldn't necessarily justify every action of every human being during the Crusades. Because it's such a contested and debated topic, attempting to find out exactly what happened can be really challenging. Each modern and historical source seems to have its own bias. Especially today, sources try to paint the Crusades in either the best or the worst light possible. And it's entirely possible that God had his plans accomplished through this time, but fallible human beings took it much too far and began operating outside of the will of God. However, the prophecy of week 8 mentions the righteous. Can God consider sinful men as righteous? Well, of course, and this is one of the main tenets of Christianity. We are considered righteous not by our own acts, but by the blood of Jesus, which washes away all sin. It's not an excuse to sin. Rather, it's a remedy for the fallen state of man. So, in fact, as we discover when reading through the Bible, God has a habit of working through imperfect human beings. Lot, according to Genesis, was extremely carnal. He offered his daughters to a ravenous mob. We get that from Genesis 19, 1 through 11. And even entered into an incestuous sexual relationship with his daughters after getting drunk. Genesis 19, 30 through 38. Yet, Lot was considered righteous by biblical standards. 2 Peter 2, 7 through 8 says, "And if he rescued Lot, a righteous man in anguish over the debauched lifestyle of lawless men, for while he lived among them day after day, that righteous man was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard." Well, how can this be? Well, it's because our righteousness isn't measured by our actions, but by our faith. In the Old Testament, we see that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness, Genesis 15:6. Today, the only difference between the believer and the unbeliever is the blood of Christ that washes away our sins. Because of that, we are considered righteous despite those sins. Now, the second part of the week 8 prophecy seems to be about the Protestant Reformation. Now, this is really interesting because in week 7, the Jewish people had their own type of rebellion against man-made traditions in favor of biblical text by itself. Near the end of week 8, Martin Luther rebelled against the Catholic Church and perpetuated a movement of Christianity that also rejected man-made traditions in favor of biblical text by itself. Isn't that amazing? Now, the temple or the houses in the prophecy likely refers to the body of Christ, since believers are described as temples in the Bible. So 1 Corinthians 6:19 says, "What know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which ye have of God, which ye are not your own?" And then Second Corinthians 5, 1 through 3 says, "For we know that if our earthly house, the tent we live in, is dismantled, we have a building from God, a house not built by human hands that is eternal in the heavens. For in this earthly house we groan because we desire to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed, after we put on our heavenly house, we will not be found naked." So when we put Christ first and truly follow him, we together become his temple. Each Christian becomes a house to the Lord. Winning souls to the Lord through faith instead of works can easily fulfill the part of the prophecy that says we Christians will acquire houses through their righteousness. The temple that is built for the Lord is the whole body of believers in Christ who trust in him for salvation rather than their own works. And again, this would have been written before Jesus, before they knew the salvation plan of Jesus. What better way to describe it if you don't know, what salvation through Jesus is going to be in the age of grace? If you're born before that, well, houses is a perfect way to describe it, and I believe that that's why it's described in the New Testament that way to make that connection. Now, probably what you all been waiting for, Enoch's apocalypse of week 9, because we're in this week. Um, Actually, we're right in the middle of the week, which is interesting. But week 9, and that idea of being in the middle of the week, right down to the year, by the way, it is really fascinating. But okay, so let's get into it. Week 9 begins to explore a future time from our own. So the Ethiopic version says, "And after that, in the ninth week, the righteous judgment shall be revealed to the whole world, and all the works of the godless shall vanish from all the earth. And the world shall be written down for destruction, and all mankind shall look to the path of uprightness." And the Dead Sea Scroll version says, "And after that, the ninth week, in it will be revealed justice and just judgment to all the sons of the whole earth, and those who act wickedly will vanish from all the whole earth, and they shall be hurled into the eternal well. All men will see the just eternal path." Now, it's probably obvious that this is referring to the return of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So this week occurs between the years AD 1675 and 2375. The exact midpoint of week 9, remember, half of 700, these weeks are 700 years long, half of 700 is 350, so 350 years after 1675 is 2025, this year, the year we're living in right now. We are right in the middle, exactly in the middle of week 9. Now, this is, as we talked about earlier, the beginning of the final. This is the beginning of the final jubilee of our age of grace. A jubilee is 50 years, according to the Essenes. I mean, technically it starts March 2026, but our calendar is a little different than theirs. But basically, this is the beginning of the final jubilee of our age of grace, the last 50 years, according to the Essenes, before the kingdom age is supposed to begin. Is that just a coincidence? Now, when I first came across this, I wanted to see if there was any indication that something was unique about this week. I wanted to know if there was any reason beyond just the interest in the year 2025 to read the prophecy this way. And I wondered if we should expect the events of this prophecy to occur at the midway point. Then I noticed the detail about how time frames within the weeks are described. There is a commonality among almost all the weeks that week 9 does not share. Most describe something happening at the close of a week, at the end of a week. However, week 9 doesn't suggest whether these events will happen at the beginning, middle, or near the close of the week. It just says in, and that made me wonder if any other week has a similar lack of description about the timing. Well, the first week gives us an idea of the timing, as Enoch says he was born on the 7th day in the first week. This would have correlated to between 600 and 700 a.m., and in fact, he was born in 622 a.m., so that's accurate. The second week, much like the ninth, does not offer us any kind of timeline. The only thing we know is a man, presumably Noah, will be saved through what we can assume is the sin of the watchers and eventual genetic and moral corruption of the entire world. Chapter 6 of the book of Enoch tells us this event began in the days of Jared. It says this is Enoch 6, verse 6. "And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it." So the days of Jared would have been between the years 460 a.m. and 1422 a.m., since that is when Jared was born and died. We know the second week would be between 700 and 1400 a.m., so this fits in as well. Also, for a man to be saved in it, it stands to reason he would need to have already been born. Noah was born in 1056 a.m. Now, note that the halfway point between 700 and 1400 is 1050. The year 1050 a.m. is exactly the halfway point of week 2. Therefore, when we're not offered a description of a specific time, such as the close or the seventh day, we have something that seems to point to roughly the middle of the week in which was born Noah, the man who was saved. Weeks 3 through 8 all have something pointing to the end of the week with the phrase at its close. Week 9 doesn't contain a hint of the timing within the description of the week. It just says in, which again, just like the second one, seems to be pointing to something happening in the middle. And then lastly, week 10 describes the seventh part. The only 2 weeks that do not offer us a time frame are week 2 and week 9. Week 2 seems to contain a reference that could be pointing to the halfway point. So, could it be that if timing is not offered, it's meant to be understood as describing events that will occur in the middle of the week, roughly? If so, could we begin to see the fulfillment of Enoch's ninth week, either exactly or roughly halfway through in or around our year 2025? Is it just a coincidence, or is it possible that this is all accurate and the year 2025 holds prophetic significance? Well, we'll get into that a little bit more later, because I have more that I want to talk about. But let's get to week 10, and then we'll talk more about our time today. But to conclude the apocalypse of weeks, the Ethiopic version of Enoch says, "And after this, in the 10th week, in the seventh part, there shall be the great eternal judgment, in which he will execute vengeance amongst the angels. And the first heaven shall depart and pass away, and a new heaven shall appear, and all the powers of the heavens shall give sevenfold light." The Dead Sea Scroll version says it like this: "And after that, the 10th week, in its seventh part, there will be eternal judgment and the moment of the great judgment, and he will carry out revenge in the midst of the holy ones. In it, the first heaven will pass away, and there will appear a new heaven, and all the forces of heaven will rise throughout all eternity, shining 7 times more." So this clearly refers to the end of the kingdom age, the great white throne judgment, and the creation of a new heavens and new earth. However, there's one small detail that could be easy to overlook if we're not careful, and that's what I want to talk about now. It's what's called the chiastic structure of the 10 weeks. And this is really important because this whole prophecy has a certain structure that we can pull even more things to learn about the weeks from it. Specifically, the ninth week, the week that we're living in now. There's a lot more we can learn.